Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. When we were planning this event, with my typical complete lack of calendar organization, I did not accommodate for this being on the same week as COGEX. So I kind of apologize for adding yet another Zoom call into what's probably a week full of Zoom calls, mostly about AI, technology, and data already. So we'll try to keep this one, I suppose, a little bit more informal. We've currently got 23 people on the call, so 24. So I think what we could probably get away with this time is leaving it a bit more open than last. So if you want to kind of chip in questions, do feel free to as well. Also on the call, my colleague Sophie Taylor is going to be helping out with sort of checking where we've got questions coming into the chat. It kind of really helps out to have someone who's able to sort of moderate those and pose them to Jess and I. But do feel free as well if you want to kind of interject at various points as well. I suppose a bit of housekeeping on this. We are recording the session. So let me know if for any reason you don't want yourself to be included in the recording. It's either potentially something I could edit out, or otherwise it might just mean that we're not able to use the recording. But either way, if you're not comfortable with that, we won't use the recording. I suppose a quick shout out to the work that we're doing at SOPRA as well. I think I mentioned on the last event, if you were there with Ivana, that the team that I work in was launching a digital ethics kind of proposition. That's now happened. So if you take a look online, so I think there's a few things like a white paper that you could read. If you look around on Twitter, that should be there somewhere. But I think that's all from me. Now I'd like to pass over to Jess. If you'd like to sort of introduce yourself and your work.
Yeah, hey everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is, like Ben said, it's a slightly strange one to be in the same week as COGEX. Although I have to say that I'm not mad. There's a part of me that's like massively missing out on the whole COGEX experience. There's also a part of me that's like, this time last year during COGEX, I was standing in the pouring rain, drying my colleagues' shoes in the toilets, and I lost my voice to the extent to which I needed two mics. So I'm kind of glad that we're not doing that again. As Ben said, I'm Jess. I have two different hats inside the University of Oxford. One is which is the hat I'm sort of speaking with roughly today, is at the Oxford Internet Institute in the Digital Ethics Lab. And that's where I'm a researcher. It's where I work on my own research, which is broadly falls under the heading of designing an algorithmically enhanced NHS. I'm also the head of policy for the University of Oxford's Data Lab, which is headed up by Ben Goldacre. So we just launched Open Safely, which is the UK's largest ever electronic health record analytics platform based off the principles of differential privacy. And kind of prior to me being solely glass tower academic, I was also used to working at NHSX. Now I just advise them. I'm not formally employed by them, but I was previously their AI subject matter expert at X. And yeah, that's kind of a bit about me. We've been doing a lot of work in this space in the OII Digital Ethics Lab over the last few weeks, but also more broadly, I guess it's kind of in our wheelhouse anyway. And it's slightly interesting to have those two hats, because it means on the one side of me, I spend all of my time thinking about the ethics of patient data use or health data use, and the other half of me, it's like, well, yeah, we now have all of these patient records, and this is what we're going to do with them. So that's it for an intro. I hope we can just have a bit of an informal chat, like Ben says, and have a bit more of a conversation rather than me just telling you things, because that would be very boring.
And I suppose I hope it's also kind of obvious as well, where I say if you want to pose questions to Jess or I, probably more so Jess has got the better answers on this than I do. That's never something that stops me from talking. It's something I probably need to train out of myself. So there's a few sort of like framing questions, I guess. Could we talk about what we mean when we talk about ethics within this context? So ethics with regards to kind of digital tracking and tracing.
Yeah. So I think actually this is an interesting, it's a topical question, because we published a version of the paper that we've been working on this as a comment in Nature a couple of weeks ago, and one of the the sort of feedback we got from that paper was, what's the difference between this, which you're claiming is an ethical framework, versus data protection law? So I guess roughly, what I would term as ethics is anything that kind of goes above and beyond the law. So the law is what I often refer to as the minimum viable ethical product. So it tells you what you can do, it doesn't tell you what you should do. And so what we mean in ethics of this context of digital tracking and tracing is what is ethically justifiable, not just legally allowed. So it might be entirely legal for you to do one thing, but there are decisions that can be made that make something more or less ethically justifiable, even if it's within the bounds of the law. And so that's kind of the broad spectrum.
Yeah, I quite like that as a description of, like, the law is the minimum ethically viable product, because I think we sometimes miss from that, where we say ethics isn't the law. That doesn't mean that the law is unethical. Like, the law is still broadly a set of codified ethics, but the law is set to be sufficiently sort of like vague that it can accommodate a lot of different technologies or companies or contexts. Whereas when we're talking about ethics, you say you have a certain amount of freedom within that law, but this is the thing you need to do over and above it to ensure that it's, I suppose, representing people's values.
Yeah, exactly. And then, like, we often talk about this concept of the normative cascade, which is sort of the idea of how the law is informed by ethics and how the law is informed by public opinion and values as much as it is by kind of legal principles. But that process can be quite slow, whereas sometimes we're operating in a dynamic scenario, and what is socially acceptable and therefore to an extent ethically justifiable moves based on a number of different contextual questions, some of which are to do with like necessity and proportionality. And in a live situation, as we are with COVID, very much live situation, that's sometimes useful to have that degree of flexibility and an opportunity to have more of a discussion. I guess the point to make there is there are obviously different ways of interpreting ethics, and this is not the forum to bore you with different types of ethics, but some people will talk about what these might call deontological ethics, which is a hard set of rules. The way I tend to interpret data ethics and AI ethics is much more to do with discursive type of ethics, which is essentially ask open questions and have a discussion about them. It allows you to come to a conclusion.
Jess, may I ask a question? I absolutely don't agree that the law is the minimum viable ethical start point. The law as it stands today would allow you to take any set of data and characterize it by an enormous number of attributes that we would say today are wholly inappropriate. So you could categorize the COVID data by sexual preference, you could categorize it by inside leg measurement, you could categorize it by skin color and how people feel about having that skin color. You could do all of that within the law. And I would argue that that is not ethical. And to say in your defense, oh, well, the law lets me, that's okay. A lot of English law goes back 200 years and more. You know, you can be arrested in Sheffield for being Welsh under a law of 1847. I'm pleased to say
we do have a law to make that illegal.
It doesn't happen very often, but today, you know, and the only crime is that you are Welsh in Sheffield under the Town Police Clauses Act of 1847. Never been repealed. That doesn't make it ethically right.
No, that's entirely correct. Like, this is why I'm saying the law allows you can. It doesn't tell you what you should do. The law doesn't also respond necessarily in a timely manner, and there are problems with the law. Like, I'm not here by me saying the law is the minimally viable ethical product. I'm not saying if you, in fact, I'm categorically not saying if you do something within the bounds of the law, that means it is automatically ethical.
I'm arguing even more strongly than that. I'm actually saying from a start point, you move out to an ethical position, and it is likely more often than not that the legal position is some way further out than that. And therefore, I would say, if you like, the law is the maximal rather than the minimal viable product, because I'm saying you're going to trip over an ethical wire and if you were to take sexual preference as an example, you're going to trip over that wire long before you get to the legal wire. It's rarely going to be the case that, say, I'm within the law, but ethically we could go a heck of a lot further.
Oh yes, from that perspective, yes, you're kind of right. Yeah, to say ethically you're unlikely to go further than the law, but then you would be outside of the bounds of the law. We framing it in terms of saying ethics is a separate like it's a separate entity from the law itself. Like,
well, I'll buy that.
You can't necessarily make them one and the same, which is an argument that I have heard a couple of times more recently, particularly on this context of digital tracking and tracing. Is it saying, people saying, it's completely legal, therefore it's ethically justifiable. And so I think we are potentially saying similar things, but within a different framing. But yeah, I do agree with you. You're very, very unlikely to get something that says the law only allows me to do this, but ethics allows me to do this. That is almost entirely unlikely to happen. Yeah.
Cool. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the paper, Jess. So I think it's ethical guidelines for SARS-CoV-19 digital. I'm forgetting the rest of the name. But,
guidelines for digital tracking and tracing of COVID.
Yes.
Something along those lines. Yeah, so that's a paper that we have kind of two versions of. There's one which is up on SSRN, which is our much more detailed sort of technical paper, I guess, and something that we're building off. And by we, I should clarify that this is me and my other authors, which is Josh Coles, Maria Rezaya Tadeo, and Luciano Torridi. And it kind of, and the second option, the second version of the paper is a much more simplified and potentially accessible, but I think overly simplified version that appears in a Nature comment from a couple of weeks ago. And it came about from actually some of the conversations that Benjamin and I were just having, is this idea that lots of people were saying, well, the law allows you to do this, blah, 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 does that mean it's okay? Or then the whole conversation had kind of just focused on centralized versus decentralized, and is one right and is one wrong. And so what we did what we do in that paper is kind of build on ethical principles that exist within other frameworks. So like within the human rights framework, within the OECD, or within the Syracuse principles, which for people who aren't familiar, the Syracuse principles are largely the basis for allowing people to override human rights, in individual human rights, in the context of a group level public health crisis. They're primarily based on physical interventions. So they're the rules that effectively allow people to be quarantined as a physical person against their will. They don't map directly onto the digital space, which is a problem in and of itself. But we sort of take the idea of them plus the ideas that are embedded within data protection law, but much more the concepts rather than the law itself, again, for reasons we've kind of already touched on, and we define sort of 16 questions based on those things. There's 4 questions which are what we call the verification questions. So are you doing the right thing? And that is like necessity, proportionality, effectiveness, and time boundedness. And then there are another 12 questions, and this is making me do maths on the fly. I'm an ethicist and a philosopher for a reason, that are more contextual questions. So some of them are really specific. They're like, is it possible for everyone to have access to the digital tracking and tracing mechanism, or is it arbitrarily given to some people and not given to others? I think I should also contextualize this slightly in saying the reason we have 2 versions of the paper is the more complicated one is actually talking about digital tracking and tracing at large. So it comes on to some of the way more invasive things that have been done, that are being trialed here, but have been more introduced in other countries. And the simplified version focuses specifically on apps, just because it was a sort of slightly publishing decision, basically. but we frame them as questions, and the answers to each question has an example of a more and a less ethically justifiable answer. The reason being is that what we're trying to get away from is this idea of there being ethical binaries. So this is definitely the ethically justifiable way, and this is definitely not. And what we're saying is that there are, in some instances, there are grey areas. And so what you should do is constantly, or not constantly, I get told off for saying constantly, regularly reevaluate the product to see if it is still right, has it been designed in the right way, and is it continuing to operate in the right way. And the reason we separate those two blocks of questions out is because effectively what we're arguing is if something is unnecessary, disproportionate, not scientifically effective, and is supposed to run for a very long time, you've hit a no-go zone immediately. Whereas the stuff, once you have passed those minimum sort of specifications, becomes much more to do with a design decision and a contextual design decision, and something that is valid and ethically justifiable in one place is unlikely to be immediately copied and pasted and be ethically justifiable in another place. Likewise, it can be something that was fine here in England on one day and then less ethically justifiable the next day. So that's kind of the broad premise of the paper that exists. What we want to do next is start looking at some empirical evidence and start doing some actual comparisons of what is out there, and trying to bring it to life a little bit more, because as much as I like philosophy and ethics and stuff, so a lot of people is very dry, so we'd quite like to sort of demonstrate the value of asking those questions.
Yeah. So what has the response been like so far to the paper?
So responses, I guess, been mixed, which is always a good thing. It's always good to have like a discussion about these things. So the criticism we had, which we sort of touched on already, which is how is this any different to data protection law? But the flip side of that we've had is lots of people saying that this prompts people to have, it's got things in there that people wouldn't have thought of previously, and that's helped people to think a little bit more about things, which I suppose is good. The more pragmatic things is we have, well, not me, Luciano has given that framework to the NHS, because he's a member of the Ethics Advisory Board, but to some other people have looked at it, and they have said it is useful to prompt thinking. That doesn't necessarily mean it has prompted action. But yeah, I guess those are the two things. One is people have said it's helped us think about things that we wouldn't have thought of originally, and the other is I don't get why this is different from the law, even though there are things in there that are different, that aren't encapsulated in the law. I guess that is something that people struggle with. I suppose the only other reaction that we've had, which is somewhat interesting, and it's actually come up more in conversation than it has in direct response to the paper, is people saying, oh, well, if you're upset, or ethicists are upset about this idea that we're being tracked, or being our phones and Google and Apple and that have been doing that for years, what's the difference? And so this completely and utterly true. My response to that is sort of twofold. One, two wrongs don't make a right. So just because it's happening already doesn't mean we should add another version of it happening. And secondly, I think we probably should have been more upset about the fact that those things happened in the first place. But we didn't.
Yeah, we could almost hope that this encourages a conversation where I think everyone, like you say, it's not a new thing for people to think, I don't like Google and Apple tracking me. Yeah. But if we take a much harder line against this, it's far more difficult to sustain a position where you say, yeah, but it's fine for Google and Apple, we'll let that one go. I wanted to pull the conversation to like the kind of overbearing current conversation, partly because I have put a poll up for the start. Being cheap as I am, I've got the free version of Slido, so I can only ask one question at a time, but it kind of works for this. So we've got one question. If you see in the chat, there's a link, which is app.sli.do. It's purely going to ask for your opinion at the offset, whether or not you side more with the centralized or decentralized model for COVID tracking and tracing. And I think we'll be describing that in more detail in just a second. But the kind of reason for that sort of working with just the one question is I want us to ask the same question at the end of this conversation as well, to see if your position has changed. And I'm almost hoping that we shift it in the unexpected way. But if I could ask, Jess, you could kind of describe what we mean when we're talking about kind of centralized versus decentralized for these contact tracing apps.
Yeah, I mean, I won't give huge amounts of technical detail, because you can go and read it online and read it by people who are way more technically competent than me. But in a nutshell, the centralized version is if you are sending the information from your phone to a centralized database, and the centralized database is held by, and by centralized I both mean that it's in a central place, as in all the data is in one place, and by the fact that it is typically the data controller is a central organization, whether that be the public health organization or the government, or in our case both one and the same. And the decentralized model of that is the information that the tracking and tracing device is app or whatever it is using is held decentralized, as in it is only on your phone, and there is not that information going into the center. It's slightly more complicated than that, and this is why I say do go and read the paper, in the fact that I think sometimes people get the impression that there is nothing going to a central place if it's only on your phone, but there is in fact a pinging mechanism that enables that tracing to happen. So it's not as if it never goes off your phone or information never leaves your phone. That isn't true, but the overarching information of I've been in contact with this person and I now have symptoms is staying in one place, and it's not leaving your phone permanently, or not creating a permanent record either.
Yeah.
Kind of make sense?
Yes, I think so.
Can I just ask a question? Is that
Yeah.
right? I was just on your point before about whether we should have been more angry about kind of Google and other companies taking our data. I was just wondering whether you think it's a problem that you end up having if we're already stuck with the fact that that's happening because of the technologies that we're using, but we're not enabling anybody else to do that. I'm not saying I agree with this opinion, I'm just mulling it over. Is it a problem then that you end up having kind of a very small number of companies who have this quantity of data over people and having kind of data monopolies?
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes, it's a problem. Data monopolies is a massive problem, but you're probably weighing up to some extent the risks of having a data monopoly and the private companies having a disproportionate amount of power that comes through that, versus there being a re-identification risk of there being multiple copies of that data in multiple places. And there's also something to be said, and again, this is not necessarily my opinion, but I think it's worth exploring. There's something to be said about who does what best. Governments, as a rule, what are we good at? Like setting policies, setting standards, setting frameworks, but typically don't have huge amounts of money to fund into technical infrastructure or technical investments, and spend thousands of millions of pounds on secure IT infrastructure. WannaCry of the NHS is a massive example of that. Whereas you have big tech companies who do have the technical capabilities to do that, and should stay in that lane, and that's what they do best. The problem that happens as a result of these types of partnerships is you start to see a blurring between those two things. And yes, someone saying in the chat, inland revenue, also a monopoly tax collector, lost 25 million sets of records. Classic example. So the risk is that because of data monopolies end up with a huge amount of power, they have a voice that's louder, and that enables them to influence government, and then that makes them the decision-making power, which is where I think you start to run into sort of slightly more dodgy area.
Yeah. And this debate, it seems to have been framed broadly by, we can't really describe them as two companies, but like two different organizations who have sort of spearheaded either the explicitly decentralized approach or the one which is kind of more ambiguous, but we tend to associate with being centralized. So that being the PEPPPT group and DP3T. I believe I'm getting that right. But I think what we wanted to do here was also talk about sort of the relative merits of each. So some thoughts of what it is that, yeah, as much as this conversation between the two of them seems to be going that the DP3C community saying we want to do decentralized is better. It doesn't mean that the big tech companies have control of your data. It means that no one has control of your data. It's stored broadly on your device. Yeah, aside from the kind of pinging happening when someone has logged on their device that they have developed symptoms, versus, oh, the government has your data in this. And it really sort of frames the debate as being, well, clearly the decentralized is the ethical approach. But could we perhaps weigh up there some of the reasons, some of the pros and cons of each?
Yeah, so this is exactly the point, why we talk about, in the paper, we talk about ethical justifiability and thresholds and things being more or less ethically justifiable rather than definitively yes, definitively no, because there is no such thing as one thing being the potential answer. And I got asked this a while ago, it was like, oh, if we have the decentralized model, does that solve all of the ethical problems? And the answer to that is obviously no, because the reason people assume that, I think, is because people assume that the only risk is privacy. Privacy is one of the considerations. It is by and large not the only one. Efficacy is a massive question of ethics. Like, does the thing actually work, and does it do what it says it will? Issues around autonomy and all of these kind of things. But if you take the centralized and decentralized model, the centralized model, yes, there is a higher chance of it being privacy invasive. There's no two ways about that. But it's also possible that if within a transparent and accountable mechanism within which people had some degree of control, that data itself could be a valuable resource for public health research, for epidemiological type studies. Again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing. It's not a good thing if no clarity over what that data could be potentially used for in the future. But in the decentralized model, you potentially lose that opportunity to use the data for different purposes. You also don't get away from the issues to do with equality of access and disproportional outcomes. For example, it's not one of the biggest risks with all of these types of technologies is the impact it's going to have on people's lives and the extent to which they are incentivized to use the thing for some types of purposes, whether this be, right, you can go back to work if you have this on your device, you can interact in the social world if you have this on your device, you can fly to this place if you have this on your device. Not everyone has access to the same device. Not everyone interprets those types of things in the same way or has the same level of digital health or digital literacy. People have also vastly different social structures which impact the extent to which these things moderate the impact that it has on their lives. None of those issues are immediately erased by having a decentralized model. In fact, they could, in some instances, potentially be exacerbated because we have no mechanism of knowing where there are regions, for example, that are at greater risk and therefore where we might want to send greater health resources to. So those are the kind of trade-offs that are not necessarily being spoken about. I think also, as someone has said, I don't necessarily consent to wider use of the data beyond tracking. I completely agree. But I think if the problem therein lies with the consent mechanism and the transparency. So where I think the NHS in particular has run into hot water with this is by continually shifting the goalpost. And that's what concerns me about the centralized model, is if you never say, we will never do it, we will never use this data for X, Y, and Z, and we will delete it at this date, that's a problem. That's not necessarily related to the immediate problem of privacy.
Yeah. Do you get the sense that that's like they're sort of like shifting goalposts now, like a lot of shifting of goalposts prior to like wide rollout, though I know they've had the Isle of Wight trial. Mm-hmm. Is there potentially a risk that they're going to continue shifting that once it's there, or do we think it will sort of be set in stone and then once it's there, terms of service have been agreed and they have to keep sorting this out?
there's always a risk. And this is one of the questions that we have in the framework is there a defined scope, or is there a risk for mission creep, both in terms of adding features to the app that allows you to do more things, or in terms of using the data for future purposes. And yeah, there are definitely risks of doing that. I think I should always preface these types of things, like I am not a massive believer in this idea that people do evil things on purpose. I think often people come from a good place, but they don't necessarily do what I would call ethical foresight analysis. So think the whole chain through, what could happen, what if, and the chances of that happening are reduced when decisions are made on the fly and they're made really quickly. So I actually think some of these conversations are really productive for the future. They're not necessarily so useful right now in the immediate crisis, because the extent to which we can influence the conversation is relatively limited. But this is by far not the last time we're going to face some kind of public health crisis with some definition. And so having these conversations now is also useful for the future. And I think it's a shame that they weren't had prior to this happening.
I mean, a lot of this it's kind of like the debate of centralized versus decentralized are two sort of technological kind of arguments or fighting points. And what's not necessarily coming into the conversation often enough is, what are the epidemiologists saying in this?
So the epidemiologists, and I work with a lot of epidemiologists and statisticians, there's a couple of things. There's one, there is data quality. So there's a sort of question, is the data actually genuinely useful to an epidemiologist? Or is this a case that there's an argument that is being made as a pro for these types of data? This is partly to do with I should also just say that I don't think epidemiologists have been asked enough, at least not in public. But there is a efficacy issue. So is the data based on genuine test results? Is it based on self-reporting? That makes a big difference. It also makes a really big difference if people are being incentivized to use the app, because that would massively alter the rate of false positives and false negatives. If you are saying, if, say, for example, any of these apps were to be linked to immunity passports, which is something that has been floated, that immediately encourages people to falsify results, because it's like saying, hey, you can go back into the workforce, which is everyone wants to do, if you've had COVID. I only have to self-report, and so I'm going to do that. If you start having those kind of misincentives and the level of false positives and false negatives skyrockets, the usefulness of that data to epidemiologists is greatly reduced. The other question is, I know that this has been posed to the sort of Apple, Google API decentralized model. Is there a way of aggregating the data in a sort of large scale pattern type information, as opposed to an individual level response, if it was to be decided that this is what we want from a public health perspective? The answer to that, as far as I'm aware, has been yes. I don't know enough about how you do that from a technical perspective in order to answer any questions on it. But I suppose the real answer to epidemiologists is the data quality high enough? Is the volume high enough? Do we actually have good enough coverage in order for this to be useful? And those are the main questions that should be asked, above and beyond the could we get access to it, because I suspect there is a technical fix to enable those two things to not be mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of my concern, is that the conversation has been too heavily overtaken by PEPVT versus DP3T, and we're losing the point of there's so much else which goes alongside this. It's not a question of whether or not it's centralized or decentralized. It's compatible with both, whether or not you have widespread testing.
Yeah, exactly. Whether you have widespread testing, whether or not there are genuine mechanisms for using it, whether or not, how are people being encouraged to use this? I think that hasn't come up enough around this sort of ethical justifiability of the types of messaging that's being used, and also the sort of incentive structure. Also, as you know, Benjamin's saying in the chat, like there's a problem with the fact that this is why in the paper we have those 4 criteria. The first thing is because when you're in a peak of a crisis, something, if you were to say, right, for 3 months everyone must do this one thing, you might not like it, but it's only going to last for this period of time, and then we're going to give and guarantee that it will stop. And then the data equivalent, that would be, we are going to delete the data, and it will be permanently deleted and no one can use it for future purposes. That is something entirely different to, actually, we're going to have a centralized model and we're going to keep it running forever, and we might turn it on and off for different flus. It might be something that we start using for the flu season just because we can. That is almost irrelevant, not completely, but it's separate conversation to centralized, decentralized. And exactly like you say, those nuances are not being had or being discussed or being surfaced because the whole conversation has focused on centralized versus decentralized.
With that sort of like turning it off, turning it on question, there was something I saw in your conversation you had with Luciano Friedi a few weeks back. We can send a link out to that. It's on YouTube as well, but another conversation on COVID tracking and tracing, where he pulled up a slide from I believe, Google presentation, where they had a line saying, we will be able to turn this off when it's no longer necessary in that region. No longer necessary according to who? Well, Apple and Google, seemingly. And that's I think a dramatic shift in like the power that we would expect our government to have in being able to control the pandemic compared to the technology companies. So it's not as though we're perhaps seeing it as decentralized doesn't actually give the technology companies any power. Well, no, they still control the API, that sort of Bluetooth access, which is making it possible that phones can communicate with each other. And if they turn that off, the app is turned off.
Exactly. That's a really, really, really great example of why these things aren't cut and dry. Like, why on earth would we be deciding that it's automatically a good thing to devolve the power for a public health intervention and whether or not it's working to a big technology company who can make those decisions in a non-transparent way and based entirely on what can only be presumed to be proprietary decisions? And I think I've spoken about this a couple of times in wider conversations around pandemics and public health and data ethics, not necessarily tracking and tracing, but this idea of the Trojan horse. Like, I think we should be very skeptical of why there has been such a rush from big tech companies to work with public health institutions at large, whether that be from digital tracking and tracing, whether it be because you want to monitor where beds are or anything. We have to be mindful of the fact that these big tech companies have wanted access to highly, highly commercially valuable health data for a long time and have been told no, 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 no. Obviously, there have been exceptions to that no, as we all know. But there is a significant risk that by getting their foot in the door through COVID, that they then end up with their whole selves in the door through mechanisms which we wouldn't have allowed to happen otherwise.
Yeah. Why do you think we're getting that sort of sense that people are being more trusting in this particular instance of big tech, when at least in the West we tend to be more trusting of our governments than big tech? Or certainly aside from that, we're generally great fans of the NHS in the UK.
Yeah. The sort of my most boring answer is I'm not entirely sure why that is happening, why people have decided to shift some trust towards these big techs. I think it is partly because people have focused in bizarrely on the decentralized issue as opposed to who is controlling the mechanism, and so because the decentralized has almost become synonymous with good and it has become synonymous with Apple and Google, but people haven't necessarily they haven't thought so much about the fact that it would be possible for a government to say we're going to run a decentralized model. There's no reason why the government couldn't develop that technological solution. It would be hard, it would be complicated, but they could do it. So I think it's because people have not necessarily separated out those issues. I do also think it is to do with a perception and a sort of understanding as well, and people's relationships with those particular companies in and of themselves. Like, people have become very familiar, if not comfortable, or unquestioning of the amount of information that those companies hold on you and on your phone. And so I almost think it's a habit of not asking hard questions, because people assume that we don't have the right, or we don't have the power to have those conversations with big tech, whereas people feel like some degree of ownership over the healthcare system or the government. Then I guess it also depends, like as you say, in the UK we are, and in the West, in Western Europe, we are by and large trusting of the government, or and people do love the NHS. I think the NHS's reputation as with data has been damaged in the last couple of years, for a variety of reasons. But that situation is obviously going to be vastly different in different countries, where people have different governments and different relationships with their government and public health sector. And because this is a conversation that's happening on almost global level, that's probably murkying the waters slightly. But like I say, that's all entirely inferred and conjecture. I have no proof to say that that's definitely what's going on.
Yeah. I think it's interesting as well when, like, the paper sort of touches on some of the wider aspects of this as well. So we have, I think, also referenced this as well, that there are some, I think, ethical challenges to digital tracking and tracing which stretch beyond privacy alone. Yeah, where I think we've spoken a little bit about things like social justice in that. What are your thoughts on some of the other concerns that we should be factoring into the conversation?
Yeah, so I think they've been lost entirely, but there are massive things to do with social justice, whether that be because of who has access to the information, who has access to these resources, but also the outcomes that this has on people's lives. Those are, because nothing is ever equal, but those things are never going to be equal, and that hasn't been vocalized enough, which I find interesting, given that I think we have started to have a quite productive conversation around inequality and health outcomes as a result of COVID. It's been needed for years. It's definitely not as loud as it should be, but it's at least starting to be voiced. And there's no reason why digital interventions wouldn't also have unequal outcomes. In fact, it's very possible that their unequal outcomes would be worse, because these things tend to be cumulative. So that's definitely one thing. There's also effectiveness. I agree, nothing will change for decades. Also an effectiveness question, like if we move slightly beyond just digital tracking and tracing, and also think about digital health interventions at large, which have been rushed through, there's very little testing of them to prove that they are effective, and to prove whether they are effective for different groups of people. And we don't have enough information yet, for example, on symptoms and how symptoms present in different groups of people, and whether everyone is affected in the same way. It's increasing evidence that they're not. But if you're relying on a self-reporting mechanism that only counts 3 symptoms that have by and large been presented in people who look like me, then I think that's a massive issue. So that's definitely one thing. Then I think there are issues to do with accountability and trust, and wider surveillance mechanisms that we haven't really talked about so much. Like, there is a really big problem that if these things prove problematic from the accountability perspective as to what is done with that information later on, who made decisions about what counts as a public health crisis, and therefore what is necessary and what is justified, who is responsible for responding if something does happen that negatively as a response to that person. So if, for example, these types of apps are used for epidemiological purposes, and it does show that people who live in certain areas or have certain lifestyles or any of these types of things are at greater risk or are acting as super spreaders, what is the mechanisms in place to say that that is not going to happen, that's not going to have a negative impact on their life? And then there are at-risk groups. So I tried to explain this previously, and I don't think I did a great job, but people, for example, who are in domestic abuse situations, people, I think, sometimes think when I've said that they are more at risk as a result of these tracing mechanisms is because people think, oh, are they going to hack and find out where they are? I think it's much more likely that you would falsify the results so that they're used by an abusive partner to tell that person that they have to stay at home. And that's where they're most at risk, because they're not at risk from COVID, they're at risk from their partner. So there are all of these types of nuances and ethical concerns that haven't been voiced and are really problematic, because if we lose trust in these massive institutions because they mess up as a result of this, what's to say that the knock-on effects of that won't be huge? And similarly, if we start using digital mechanisms to massively infiltrate and interrupt people's lives, that's got nothing to do with privacy. It has everything to do with autonomy, people's rights to be themselves, people's rights to flourish, people's rights to have some degree of a wider concept of privacy, not just who has access to my data and can people see me, but do I have right to make a decision over my own life? All of these things are altered by these types of technologies. So those are my bigger concerns as well.
There's a few bits in that I'd like to pick out on. The first one is to kind of speaking about how quickly people are trying to reach sort of decisions on this, and is there a sense that the sort of pace of change that COVID has forced us into, is that something which either on the one hand reduces the moral imperative that we see around this, or if not, does it decrease our ability to at least act appropriately on the moral imperative, which we would hope stays the same?
So to answer the second part of that question first, yes, I do think it limits people's chances, because decisions are made really quickly, and decisions are made with, and this is partly what I was saying about messaging is important, decisions are made under this guise of, oh, this is to save lives, you must do this, and it is your social and moral responsibility in order to accept this, and people accept that. When you're told that by a governing body, you are going to accept that that is your moral duty, and people don't have the right to ask those questions. Also, a lot of the mechanisms that we have developed in the last few years in the NHS as a response to things like Royal Free incident and care.data, but they've also happened by and large because of the, I think, great awareness of the public's, and I mean public's plural, not apostrophe, yes, right to have a say in these types of conversations. All of the lovely mechanisms that have enabled that to happen, whether that be through engagement activities or anything, are rushed through or don't happen because of the speed of change. I don't think the first part of that question, in terms of does the moral imperative or does it change, in theory, no. In practice, yes. So there is something to do with necessity and proportionality. And if you think about it in physical space, there is in almost no other circumstance would we think it is ethically justifiable to say to a person against their will, you must stay put in that one place. That is something that we would in any other circumstance not consider ethically justifiable. There has to be some extent of parallel in the data space. I don't necessarily mean that just with the apps. I think you've also seen that that's why data protection law, that's why common law of confidentiality, for example, is designed to flex in circumstances of public crisis. I think it's interesting that we haven't necessarily seen equal responses in things like misinformation and disinformation online, and not just immediately blocking or removing stuff that is inherently harmful. So it's not necessarily that the moral imperative changes. I think the threshold does change, and I think what is socially acceptable does change, but I think the key there is that it's time bound. If those things are only true for a fraction of the time, and if we start spreading outside of this time, and this is partly what I mean about the Trojan horse effect, I think people will, there is a risk that you start to have a slippery slope. So people have accepted this, and therefore they might accept this. So if they've accepted it for 4 weeks, maybe they'll accept it for 6, and then all of a sudden these things are in place all the time. So that is definitely a concern as to why those things are different at different times and in different contexts as well, which is definitely a thing that isn't thought about enough. So yeah, I guess that's kind of my rambling answer.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen things like maybe people have the sort of thought, and I'm no lawyer on this, but I'd be getting this horrifically wrong. But with GDPR, it means, well, you can't use my data in a certain way, or I have certain absolute rights guaranteed by GDPR. But as I understand it, there's the principle of proportionality in there, which is kind of like, if we've got, I used to frame this as things like, if you imagine there's a large terrorist attack, the government may say it's proportional for them to be able to access your data without having those same sort of like permissions. But now that sort of like, does that principle of proportionality apply to COVID? It seems like a highly proportional reason to expect some maybe erosion of what we historically have regarded as being GDPR incomplete. But that does seem to shift.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, that is right. That is effectively what has happened. There are mechanisms within the GDPR that are specifically for public health purposes and to do with proportionality. There are also specific instances within the NHS's common law of confidentiality. Indeed, that's how almost all of these mechanisms are working, is within that flex within the law, specifically COPI 3 or Confidential Patient Information Regulations 3.
Yeah.
Nerd out. It's all written up by the National Data Guardian if anyone wants to check it.
Yeah.
I think the more interesting question, and this comes slightly to some of the things we've had said already about like the role of Google and Apple, etc., is what worries me is the public isn't involved in the conversations as to what counts as a public health crisis, or what counts as something where we suddenly deem to have a response to this. In this mechanism, yeah, maybe we listened to the World Health Organization and they said it was a pandemic and that's kind of what kicked off the chain of events, but that's not what's always going to happen, particularly as we decide in the UK, or in England at least, to isolate ourselves more and more from the global community for reasons unknown. But like these are questions that are going to arise if there isn't transparency and accountability as to saying these are the circumstances within which these types of mechanisms kick in. When those circumstances are no longer in place, things reverse immediately and they go back to normal and we are going to delete everything. It's the lack of those transparency and accountability mechanisms and honesty, really, that concerns me more than the fact that the data protection law is designed to flex, because as we all know, like, data does save lives in certain instances, and so it is probably right, quote unquote, that there is a degree of flexibility, but without transparency as to why that flexibility exists and how it is enacted, that is a much bigger problem than the fact that the mechanism for flex exists in and of itself.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I think I set this Zoom call from 6 till 7. I think it's just going to keep going for as long as it does until I press end, but there is a slim chance that in like 2 minutes everything's going to disappear. Hoping it doesn't do that. Another thing that I was wondering about, like, what are your thoughts on like there are kind of wider things that could happen with digital tracking and tracing which aren't the NHS's app? So there's conversations around things like, I mean, it's already happening at airports. They're using things like thermometers potentially to scan people. That could be rolled out into a train station. We could foresee a time when we might be sharing more data with things like our transport providers to be able to judge when trains are busy and to better level out the kind of number of people on each train carriage so that they're able to social distance more effectively. It's not saying that like those are applications which say if you've been in contact with someone with COVID, that's it's going to tell you that you need to remain isolated for 2 weeks, rather to say that we could use tracking and tracing as well to mean that there are less instances where you do come in contact.
Yeah, absolutely. So I try and be technical in an interesting way. So I think part of the problem is we often blur what we refer to as the level of abstraction, which just means the level at which you're placing your lens of analysis. So very often we focus only on what we would call the individual level of abstraction, and that is by and large the level at which the contact tracing apps is operating at. Is it's my person, my data, my instruction to isolate, maybe a few other people. The other types of things that you're talking about in terms of like notifying people where areas are busy or where things are not busy, or telling those who may be deemed clinically vulnerable, this is a safer time for you to travel and this is a non-safer time for you to travel. The level of abstraction is by and large at the group level, and the risks and the mechanisms and the questions we should be asking are similar but different, and so I think it's important that we recognize that those things are slightly different, because whilst your risks at the group level analysis where you're non-identifiable might not be the same as the ones that where you are as an identifiable individual, so the risks become less about individual level privacy, for example, and they might become more about what can be inferred about you at a group level, and that starts to play in sometimes more of this social inequality issue. And issues to do with power and power dynamics and how that system might be exploited in order to give people some people more movement than other types of people. Those are all the types of questions we should be asking. They're different questions to the ones I might ask about an individual digital tracking and tracing mechanism.
Yeah. Where do you see the oversight laying on that? Are we going to end up with a similar question? Like, is the government going to regulate this more heavily? In as much as like Google's had the ability to do this for decades, you know, they can tell us when roads are busy, and I think to an extent they might even tell us when certain train services are busy. They're certainly not to the kind of granularity of what carriage should you get on.
No, but you will get those things where you see, for example, if you go on a shopping centre, if you look at that on Google, you will see that time bar that shows you the busier times of day.
Yeah.
And that is all based on the same mechanisms for which you are discussing. I think in terms of who will be responsible for regulating it, this is such an open question about who is responsible for regulating big tech at large. And what my response to that is, I think you have to rely on a mechanism of what we call distributed responsibility. So there are different parts of the chain that play different parts in monitoring it. So you might have the government is in charge of setting laws or legal regulations, but that operates on one level of time. You will also have to have responsibility, like the public has a responsibility to say what it does not think is acceptable. So one route to do that is through social media, it's through protesters we've seen, it's through the press. So the responsibility has got to be spread out just because things operate on different timelines. I don't think that the government is potentially the right people to although it would be the right organisation because it has the legal power in order to make laws, it's not necessarily the right organisation in order to tell people who should make those decisions and what those decisions should be, by and large because the government is not good at being representational. So you need a form of independent evaluation, I think, and that independent evaluation should be made up of a broad range of voices that you won't get from the government. So yeah, I think it has to be independent.
Yeah. Is tech much better though at getting that, I guess, diverse perspective?
No, I'm not saying it should be tech who does it either.
Yeah.
I'm saying it should be someone it should be an organisation that is responsible for representing all views and is independent from all of those places. Partly because it needs to be an organisation that does not have perverse incentives or conflicts of interest. So people need to be in that conversation solely for one purpose and set aside their other responsibilities or incentives for a different.
Yeah.
Jess, that's going to be really difficult. If you take Ben's example of monitoring at railway stations, it's in a public transport operator, whether it's a bus or a train or a plane, doesn't matter. It's in their interest to fly as few or to run as few services as possible
Mm-hmm.
and have them packed to the doors with people standing. You know, one train with 1,000 people costs the train company less than 2 trains with 500 on each. So if they are going to advise when we're full and when we're busy, the way the airlines do it historically, it's got nothing to do with your temperature, but it's got everything to do with your wallet.
Mm-hmm.
What they say is, you want to fly when it's busy, we'll charge you, and they regulate loads by yield management. I don't understand why anybody needs to regulate that beyond an individual thing. If I'm going to travel by train from London to Edinburgh, then I kind of take my chances. And if somebody says, actually, we can help you a bit by saying, if you take the 10 o'clock train, it's not as busy as the 11 o'clock train, I'm still taking my chances. Nobody is guaranteeing me anything on that. Why does it need to be regulated at all?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And actually, by and large, I'm quite a big supporter of the idea of buyer beware markets. So this idea that you are transparent about the risks, but then you allow people to make up their decision, their own mind as a grown up. And I think that actually is, in some instances, regulation of apps, for example, is a really classic example where I think regulation is never going to keep up, and therefore a sort of broad brush approach of people being aware that they are downloading this app that says it might do this thing, and it may equally not. It is their own decision, and they have been fairly warned that it's their own decision. So from that perspective, I actually agree with you. I don't think you should be necessarily regulating what is and is not allowed by those companies from that type of perspective. I think what Ben was getting at slightly more is what is allowed from a data use in order to do those types of things. I think because
I get that, but the assumption is that if you're talking about group apps, they're not collecting personal data. In that, if I'm on a crowded train, in principle, I don't mind who the other 999 people are. I just don't want them to be there. Whoever they are, however nice they are, and whether they're my kind of person or not, whatever that means, I just don't want them there. There's no personal data issue. It's purely a crowd dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. Hence, in all legal frameworks within which anonymous data or group data is treated entirely differently from individual and personal level data. What I am saying more is there should be at least someone who is looking at the group level effects of that. So does it end up being that you have some people who are then effectively excluded from services because of the ramifications? I'm not necessarily saying the concept in and of itself is a bad one. And in actual fact, I think that would probably be a good thing if people are given information in order to make decisions within a sort of informed space. It's not inherently bad, but the potential for the potential for knock-on effects that are unequal is there, and we should be aware of them.
Can I just ask how you think the public can ensure that it has a role? As you say, it should participate. And whether you said by to the press or social media or protests, but how that requires them to be so proactive, and it's such a difficult thing to monitor. And how does one open up the discussion more to make it easier for the public in general to be consulted without feeling it's got to sort of fight to keep up with what's going on? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
you've got to force your way in to be heard and to know what's going on. And if you don't make that huge effort, A, you feel very inadequate, but B, you lose your chance to participate. I don't know how public forums can be created where the public does have a role without 1,000 billion voices coming in, which makes anything impossible.
It reminds me slightly of like the kind of original, like where people have this, I guess, rose-tinted perspective of Athenian democracy, which is direct democracy. Like anyone could, there's a lot of caveats to this. Anyone, provided you a mail, could go to the whatever it was, the kind of main thing, and you would vote, and they would build the laws out of that.
You weren't a slave.
Imagining that they weren't male exclusive, that's still not very inclusive. Like, there are people whose jobs didn't permit them to get there. There are people who were too old to be able to travel to that location. There were people who didn't have the time or were less engaged. And just because
Yes.
you're less engaged doesn't mean that your opinion needs to be less included.
No.
My guess is that some of the answer to this would come from the same way that people try to do user research in kind of businesses as it is, where we try to identify what a reasonable cross section is. So, who are the customers that we're dealing with? Are there people that we're not considering but also need to engage with the service? Who are the most vulnerable out of that?
Yeah.
And what are like the appropriate interviewing mechanisms that we need to have? Do we need to ask questions in a different way to someone who has a certain impairment or a different
It's that you feel the government would really rather we didn't interfere with their decisions, and the tech giants equally, I mean, and also we have that lovely thing of where, people, as you said earlier, tend to be so trusting of the tech giants, and but obviously there are huge suspicions as well going on in society, but it's on the whole, people just download an app without really thinking about what it might not mean that much at this moment, but the potential, as you said earlier, the foot is in the door, and that the whole body could enter through that door eventually.
I really like your answer on this as well, Jess, but just because I can see people dropping off, I put into the chat another Slido link. So it'd be interesting if you could click on that one as well and re-answer whether or not you're kind of siding towards that centralized or decentralized. Though so much of what we said is that the conversation is wider than centralized versus decentralized. I'd like to see if the kind of needles moved in any way from one to the other since we've spoken. But Jess, did you have some thoughts on Sarah's point there?
Well, other than I think it's an excellent one. And the other thing is to say is when I say protest, social media, the press, those are general mechanisms for the public getting their voice heard, as opposed to the way of it working in this specific mechanism. I think the unfortunate answer is I don't think there is any guaranteed way of it happening. I suppose there are mechanisms in place. So, for example, like with research funding for like the type of stuff that we're doing with electronic health records is premised on the basis that we would do what's called public and patient engagement. So it is only given to us if we go and ask people in the way that Ben has described, by like saying, these types of people can engage in this type of way. There's also the role of representative groups. So I have tried to speak, for example, to medical research charities a lot over the last couple of weeks, and they are absolutely slammed because they are being asked from every single direction possible of like, can you provide the patient voice for your type of individual groups? So there are definitely mechanisms in place.
I think what is great is I think universities are so important here. I think that's what's so fantastic about the job that you've got and what you're doing, because universities really do represent what is human, the best that is human, and to stand up for the human in all of these things. And so I think it's terrific. I'm not just saying this to gush, but I genuinely think it's great that you are doing what you're doing and just chipping away and keeping asking the questions. Very good. Yeah.
So Ben, I don't know if you wanted to look at the results of the poll or.
Yeah, let's have a look and see. So I can tell you for sure the first poll was pretty clear. Oh wait, how do I get the results of that one back? I'm very confused. All right, view results. For the question that we asked at the start, 11% responded centralized, 89% responded decentralized. We have shifted that somewhat. So now the answer is 25% centralized, 75% decentralized. Still, there's a thought that people are leaning towards decentralized, but it's more even. I think sometimes what I take from that is like, I kind of went through that thing of I initially thought like, yeah, why is anyone supporting a centralized model? But it's for me shifted where I think actually there are possibly some good reasons for us to go centralized. If that's what epidemiologists are saying generates better data, then that's a good argument. Then if we're saying perhaps we could do that same thing with the decentralized data, well, yes, that's kind of shifting the needle back the other way, but then it's giving too much power to big tech. So I mean, it's difficult necessarily to get a clear-cut answer, but people are perhaps deliberating one versus the other. But if one of the questions is like, to be effective, we need as many people to use it as possible. Ideally, I think minimum 20% to be even slightly useful, but it's more like 40 to 60% where it starts doing interesting things. Yeah, maybe we just have to say that's the public fault. So better to go with the one, even if it's not the perfect data.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. I should just flag that Sophie has just made an important point, which I didn't make because I was worried that we were running out of time. Universities are a fantastic mechanism. I'm obviously highly biased because I work for one. So it would be a bit of a problem for me to say that I disagree with them. My entire research group is entirely white, and I am one of 2 females in a 15 group. Person group. That is an issue. We aren't particularly great at being representative. I suppose there's an onus on people like me, and what I do try and do is make sure that we find spaces in order to give different people's voices the opportunity to speak. I worry a lot that comes across as patronizing, and that's like me saying that I can create the space, and I'm not necessarily sure that that's right. So I think there definitely has to be greater pressure put on institutions to follow through when they say they will do genuine public engagement, and to go to the organizations and to the people who can make sure that those voices are heard better than us in and of itself. So yeah, thanks Sophie for pointing that out. It's very, very important.
Yeah, you end up in a weird place where it's kind of like we can see universities as being like the kind of best of us in one regard, but certainly not in all regards. Universities are like pretty exclusively the best at being academic, I suppose, or certainly the best at being at university. And to an extent, we also want the opinions that are the worst of us. And I don't mean that as in any way. I suppose I'm using it in a slightly controversial sense. I know there are instances where it's things like if Eamon Holmes is saying we should give an equal voice to people who think that we should tear down 5G masts because it's spreading COVID, that's not something we need to give an equal voice to, but we need to give an equal voice to a much larger group of society. And it's not to say that people who are at university are the best or the kind of the exclusive opinion in that, or the best at generating the opinion, but certainly have a place in collecting opinions, and a part. They are undeniably one part of that whole group.
Absolutely.
Also on your point on the 5G thing, like, don't we also need to question why people think that and why they lack trust in like public communications? I think that engagement also is about what we mean by like knowledge and who holds knowledge and has power over.
Yeah, no, completely. In fact, one of the things we've been working on more generally is this concept that the infosphere, so the informational environment within which people live, very broadly construed, should be reclassified as a social determinant of health. So the information that people are exposed to in different environments for different reasons is having a direct physical impact on their physical health. And I don't think public health institutions have taken that seriously enough, or asked the questions that you're sort of alluding to understand why people do trust that information. There's some stuff to do with digital health literacy, which almost always comes back to the things that we've known for years, like do people have rights, equal access to education, and all of this type of stuff. And I have found it very bizarre that we have gone down a route of, like I said, like gross physical restrictions on people, and we don't think that's a problem at all, and yet we haven't necessarily mirrored those things in the informational environment, because we get worried about free speech and these types of things, and yes, it's a massive oversight, and something that I hope will change as a result of this stuff that's happened to do with COVID, because it's been a long time coming.
Cool. I'm going to ask what sounds like the sort of like ending on a positive note type question, but do feel free if others want to sort of chip in more questions as well. We're often kind of hearing people talk about COVID as being like a quite defining moment, which is going to set this sort of future trajectory for our approach to technology, approach to data. How do you think we can use this as a time to make sure it is a positive trajectory?
Hard. a good question. Well, I suppose there's two things for that. One, I think it's partly there is a little bit of a risk of this becoming we tend to overestimate what we can achieve in 1 year and underestimate what we can achieve in 10 type of scenario. There's definitely a little bit of over optimism of COVID is going to change the world for the good. So healthy skepticism around that type of messaging, I think I encourage. In terms of what I think is a good thing, I think there has needed to be a watershed moment for people realizing the benefits and the usefulness of health data in order to start having much better and more productive and more informed conversations about it, as opposed to purely we don't want anyone touching it ever type conversations, which is a gross oversimplification of what has been discussed, but by and large in the public domain that's what's happened. So I think if we can harness the fact that people realize that health data can be used for a force for good, that there are technical ways of making sure it's safe and secure, and that good benefits can come out of it. And then for the fact that actually maybe it's not the data itself that's useful, it is the gaps in the data and what it isn't telling us. So why do we not know that certain types of ethnic minority groups are more affected by COVID, and it's not a medical reason, it's not recorded in their medical record, then there's a problem that we need to go and find out why. So I think if you can push to see the benefits, those sort of more strategic type benefits, I think that can be how we make sure that something good comes out of COVID and the data use that's happened.
Awesome. We said we'd close at 7:30, but do we have any other questions from the audience you'd like to put to us before we?
Do you want me to read the ones from the chat from earlier on?
Yeah, sure.
They've both left, but I guess in case they watch the recording. Julie asked, I want to understand the rationale for a binary view on good and bad for open source. For example, there are approaches where the SDKs of a company can be open source and available for inspection on GitHub, whereas the core code may be available for inspection by major clients, auditors, and governments rather than the general public.
So I think that has happened as a result of an oversimplification for people who, and this is part of a wider AI ethics conversation, which I'm sure you guys have had previously, about this idea that visibility automatically means accountability. And so I think people automatically assume that if code is available in the public domain, the people who have produced said code can be held accountable for why they wrote it in a certain way. And that tends to be why that open sourceness is seen as good. I think it is, again, like we've said 1,000 times, more complicated than that. I'm a massive advocate, by the way, for open science and open source, and the entirety of the open lab of the data lab is open source. But it doesn't necessarily result in change or in people being held to account. And we should also be aware of the fact that GitHub and those types of platforms are inherently exclusionary. They are reliant on people having certain skills and certain access, and not everyone does. So I think, yeah, there's a falsehood that visibility means accountability. That's why their binary has happened. I don't think it's true. I think it's more complicated. Things are only held to account if there are mechanisms for holding people to account. And that doesn't just happen just because something's in the public domain.
I found it super odd that the main response the D3PC or DP3C, I forget, gave to the other community on their shift, or like the removal of the explicit mention of it being decentralized, was like it was a PDF uploaded to GitHub. No one's looking there for this. It's full of developers, but everyone else needs to hear this as well. Why is it hosted there? It's such an obscure platform to put down.
Precisely. Yeah.
Did you say there was a second question, Sophie?
Yeah, there's one more from Benjamin right at the start. He asked, what do we think of the 20-year retention?
Oh, yeah. I think that was insane. That's my short answer. No, I think it's not inherently problematic. I think the problem was that it wasn't declared at first. So people had started to make decisions before they had that piece of information. And then I think a lot of it comes down to, are there any restrictions placed on why you're holding that data? So why was 20 years picked? For one thing, I don't know. And two, is it a sort of, this is going to sit here for 20 years, we're not going to touch it, and then we'll delete it, or is it a scenario of it's going to sit here and we're going to use it for these very specified purposes? If I had those information and the answers to those questions, I would be able to make a more informed decision about it. But the problem is not the 20 years in and of itself, it's the fact that people weren't told about that up front, and there's no clear rationale for it. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? You can type them, but also I think you're able to unmute yourself if you want to venture any questions before we close. Okay, I think that's all questions then. So I suppose to wrap up, first of all, thanks to everyone who's dialed in. I know as this is like an AI community and this is the week of CogX, you've probably spent too much time today with headphones on dialing into Zoom calls. So thank you for putting up with even more. Thanks as well to Sophie for helping us field the questions and for your own questions as well. Thanks as well for the audience questions and helping us, I think, have a more rounded debate on it. Thanks especially to you, Jess, for giving us time from your evening and insightful thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for asking good questions, and for being questioning in and of itself. And yeah, stay in touch. I'm around on most places on the internet. So yeah, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks to Ben also for organising all of this, and wonderful job. Very, very important. And thank you, Jess, for giving your time for this. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And to you too, but Sophie, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Just while I remember as well, if for any reason you don't want me to share the recording online, what I will most likely do is like upload it to YouTube, but as like an unlisted video, and just post it out to the people that signed up. Just let me know. Either I can try to edit bits out, or we'll find another way to try and work around it. But if for any reason you want that, let me know. But yeah, thanks. Hope you'll have a great evening and a great rest of the week. So speak to you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.